Check 1 2, mic check 1 2.
budget hearing conducted by the Committee on Appropriations and Adjudications will now come to order. Notice of the budget hearing was disseminated to all local media outlets via electronic format on Monday, May the 8th, 2017, with a second notice provided on Wednesday, May the 10th. Notice of the hearing was also made known on the Guam Legislature's website. This afternoon, we are meeting with the Bureau of Budget Management Research to discuss the Fiscal Year 2018 Executive Budget Request, Bill number 22-34, relative to General Fund revenue projections by revenue category. Let me introduce my colleagues that have joined me. To my right is my Vice Chair, Senator Frank Uggan, Senator Will Castro, Senator Tommy Morrison, Senator Mike Nicholas, Senator Tom Atta, and Senator Dennis Rodriguez. To my left, Senator Talina Nelson, Senator Regine Bisco-Lee, and Senator Mary Camacho-Torres. The FY 2018 Executive Budget Request was submitted on January the 31st and was subsequently introduced by the Committee on Rules on February the 16th as Bill number 22-34. Beginning today and throughout the next few months, the Committee on Appropriations will be holding several budget hearings with departments and agencies of the Government of Guam. As was done last year, the committee is beginning the fiscal year budget hearings by discussing how much revenues our government projects to receive before we even discuss the proposed expenditures of those revenues. This first hearing should be very simple. I just want to hear the justifications, reasoning, rationale, etc. for the general fund projections in the Governor's FY 2018 Executive Budget Request. Over the past few years, the Governor's General Fund revenue projections have been extremely aggressive. As a result, the Guam Legislature has reduced these overly aggressive General Fund revenue projections to more attainable levels. That has been the right thing to do. Actual General Fund collections have been much closer to the adopted projections, and recently the Governor has touted in his State of the Island address the Legislature's commitment to frugality. With those more conservative General Fund revenues, the Legislature has limited the ability of the executive branch to spend more than collected. Just a brief overview. The Governor's FY 2018 General Fund projection is $722.4 million, which is an increase of $41.2 million or a 6.05% increase above 2017 adopted levels of $681.2 million. This increase is mainly attributable to large increases in withholding taxes, interest and penalties of 18.9% or a 7.15% increase, business privilege tax of $11.8 million or 4.78 increase, and the individual income tax of 10.6, a 10.5 increase. I want to thank the Bureau of Budget and Management for attending the hearing today and would like to provide you an opportunity to present the General Fund revenues to the Guam Legislature today. I want to challenge you to convince my colleagues here today that the Governor's General Fund revenues are backed by sound analysis and are indeed attainable. Before I have them ask questions, I would like to pose a few questions. The executive budget request projection for individual income tax is $111.4 million, which is a $10.6 million or a $10.6 million increase, or a 10.5% increase over FY18 projection of $100.8 million. Please provide your justification and rationale for why the committee should adopt this increase. Mr. Claus?
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and members of the 34th Guam Legislature here today. Are we going to be talking about specific categories one by one, sir, or would you?
Yes, I would. I'm going to be going down each category just so I can try to help me convince my colleagues that these projections are attainable. And a 10.8 increase is fairly substantial. I thought maybe you'd explain how you got that number.
Okay. Well, as a backdrop, I'd like to be able to state for the record that the budget request, as stated by the Speaker, was submitted on January 31st, and it reflects a continued optimistic approach to our economic growth. That economic growth has been substantiated and is included in the executive budget request by the government's chief economist, Mr. Gary Hiles, who has some very enlightening and profound statements, which we took to heart in being able to project the revenues that are contained in the governor's fiscal year 18 request. Similarly, the Speaker and some of the members of the legislature were present on April 20th when Mr. Joe Bradley, chief economist for the Bank of Guam, recently provided an update on Guam's economy for the island. And one of the main takeaways is that he continues to believe that if we can just get through a couple of federal issues, that Guam is still poised to be able to continue a relatively robust economic future. And with that as a backdrop, we were looking at how we would be able to translate this continued economic activity, albeit somewhat muddled by some recent federal action, which we are continuing to address head on, specifically the H-2 visa waiver.
I'm sorry. Why don't you continue, Mr. Carlson?
Sure. Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. It was in consultation with folks outside of the traditional government revenue forecasting circles that we made sure that we weren't thoroughly out of touch with what we believed would be obtainable. And albeit aggressive, and to the Speaker's point, maybe it's going to take some convincing, but there is a process, and I would like to point out today that your statement, Mr. Speaker, about convincing this body today, I would hope that we would not have to convince you today that these numbers are what you should take to heart, but rather I would encourage the open participation of the Special Economic Service and Special Accounting Service interactions, which we found to be extremely helpful in being able to engage dialogue, not just between the Bureau, the administration, and the elected body of the 34th Guam Legislature, but there are also some additional roundtable opportunities to avail, especially the new senators, with an opportunity to kind of understand where people are coming from, and that things are not taken either as black or white, but more holistically and brought to a forum maybe more conducive to understanding where everybody's coming from, as opposed to saying, this is high, this seems really like, you know, a continuation of overly optimistic revenue projections. I would submit to the members here today that we are thoroughly open to continued dialogue. This document was provided in January. I must state for the record that there are some challenges that we know that we have before us, and we would like to discuss those head on. Among them, going back to the speaker's first question in line with withholding taxes, there may be some concern about the potential for the establishment of a new tax plan as proposed by President Trump. I would submit that we should probably take this up in a group discussion, not in this forum, simply because that legislation or that campaign promise hasn't resulted in anything. You know, it's right now there hasn't even been a bill introduced to address tax reform. I would submit that it's time for us to roll up our sleeves and talk. I don't profess to be, or my you know, very esteemed colleagues that have joined me today, which I would be remiss if I didn't introduce at one point or another during this time. I'm sorry, guys. But you know, we really would like to take the opportunity to not reach across and, you know, gravitate to who's right and who's wrong, but really engage in a more open dialogue. So with that, I offer this transmittal from the governor as a beginning for dialogue. I would encourage that we take to heart the fact that we do very much appreciate the legislative process, and that there are some items, the H2 issue that's right before us, that if resolved may not be a factor in fiscal 18. So again, excuse me, it is May 16th. We do have the opportunity to unify our voice to the USCIS to be able to try to dislodge that backlog of visa applications. I think that we should work together with respect to other items, such as the Section 30 issue that we went round and round and round over the last couple of weeks on. We're in communication with the latest correspondence from the Congresswoman, and I'm heartened at the tone of the letter. And I think that we have sufficient time to be able to address some of the concerns that we discussed in special session with respect to what that particular level of revenue may or may not be. I just don't think that the ship has sailed. And I would hope that this body agrees that we have some dialogue to address together. So with that, we do have the revenue projections by category, as the speaker had pointed out, beginning with the amount for individual withholding, which does result in a 10.5 almost % increase. Holistically, though, he was on point as saying that rather than looking at the individual components, that the entirety of the general fund revenue source does represent a 6% increase. We think that if we take into account some of the dialogue that was contained in the economic outlook provided by Mr. Hiles and supported by Mr. Bradley, less than a month ago, that the procurement resolution on military projects and the funding that has been provided for the build-up, coupled with a recent release from GBB on another stellar month of tourism arrivals, that we should take into consideration the fact that we are really just being held back by things that, you know, we should collectively try to overcome. And in overcoming those issues, I think we'd be in a better position to then understand where the revenues might just lead us.
You were the one that brought up the business construction. And what Mr. Hiles and what maybe Mr. Bradley said. We were looking at the Guam Department of Labor Statistics, their website. Last year, they showed that between October and April, there was $14.5 million awarded in contracts. In FY15, they showed between October and April that there was $284 million awarded in contracts. And in FY14, that site on the website showed $136 million being awarded from October to April. When we checked this morning, unless the website is down, they've discontinued working on it, it's showing 0. Do you have any information that would dispel that finding?
You're referring to the Department of Labor's building permits posting on the website, showing 0? I would find that extremely difficult to believe, and I would attribute that to some kind of either lack of reporting, lack of update. I know we met with former Senator Mabini about 2 weeks ago, and Mr. Hiles, and they were extremely they were looking for assistance, particularly with that division as a whole, and Gary's group as in particular. They're very strapped for personnel. So again, going back to what Mr. Hiles provided, which is contained in the transmittal, he notes a number of private sector businesses that are looking to begin construction. I think I may have mentioned, and I hope Mr. Caesar Cabot isn't tripping every time I bring his name up, but when you're looking at in this, despite what it is that is transpiring now with H2, he still went forward in groundbreaking for his medical arts plaza, and I commend people like that for being bullish on the economy and still thinking that this is the right time, and with that as a continual line of thinking, I think that that's where we're coming from, as far as the administration with submitting a budget for discussion and dialogue, and certainly not cornering the market on being able to say, my number is better than your number. And I would hope that it's an active discussion.
I'm not saying my number is better than any number. I'm just saying that where we usually go to look to see what activity there is, it's showing 0. If you could confirm that and get information back to us, I would really appreciate that, because I'm really hoping it's wrong.
Yes, sir. In my heart of hearts, I think you're right and it's wrong, but we'll confirm. Thank you.
Thank you. Can the Bureau explain how the additional child tax credit reimbursements are accounted for in its $111.4 million projection for individual income tax?
My understanding, and I preface that by saying it's my understanding, is that the ACTC is more or less a revolving account where it's used, the credits are taken, then there's a reimbursement. So the reimbursements occur several times during the course of the fiscal year. How that plays into the individual income tax refund question, I really would have to defer to Mr. Camacho or Mrs. Benito.
Okay. I'll have to save that for them then. The executive budget request projection for corporate taxes is $141.8 million, which is a very it's only a 0.08 increase over last year's. No, it's actually under last year's 142. Can you explain to the committee how that happened?
Again, sir, one of the mechanisms that the Office of Finance and Budget and BBMR utilize are 3 to 5 year lookbacks with respect to trends. And one of the hallmarks of budget forecasting that we utilize, and I'm sure the Office of Finance and Budget is guided primarily by historical information. That's the leading indicator of why it is that we're looking at where corporate income taxes are. And the speaker is correct. It is about $1.1 million less than what was authorized in the 17 budget.
And I noticed in the AS 400 just recently a fairly substantial increase in corporate taxes, because I was really concerned about corporate taxes in the last CRER. It was down substantially. And then I know the most recent CRER isn't due until next week, but there's been some major deposit. I would have thought most of the corporate one would have come in October.
Yes, sir. One of the indications of why that might be lagging is because of the change in the filing date. I think Mr. Camacho mentioned that recently in either our oversight hearing or one of the other hearings, but the corporate filing date was moved to April, if I'm not mistaken. So you have a difference in when the revenues were supposed to be received, for corporate filing. It was March. This year it's April. So you'll probably be seeing a reflection in the upcoming CRER.
Okay. And for withholding taxes, the FY18 budget projects $283.1 million, which is a almost $19 million increase, or about a 7.17 increase over FY17 projections. Can you provide us with some information as to how that number was arrived at?
Again, during the preparation of the document, which began late last year and was transmitted at the end of January, there was this feeling that there was going to be a rise in some of the employment opportunities simply because the military buildup and opportunities with the continued tourism numbers were presenting local people with an opportunity to be gainfully employed, maybe even get some overtime associated with particularly maybe filling some construction jobs that had not been filled by H2 workers, therefore allowing for some overtime to be incurred by some of our regular, our born and bred workforce, which may have resulted in higher withholding just simply because there was a labor gap that needed to be filled, and we felt that, again, being very optimistic that that gap would have some benefit to the local people, vis-a-vis, and also the government in withholding.
In some of our earlier hearings this year, there was a considerable discussion about the provision for tax refunds. The FY18 budget has a $125 million provision. And if my reading is correct, or at least the information I have, FY13 was 137, well actually 138 million. 14 was 154. 15 was 148. 16 was 149. And I think we were recently told that this year may get up to as high as 147 for the provision for tax refunds. Does the Bureau have a position on what the provision ought to be in the budget for this year, for this upcoming fiscal year? We've exceeded it considerably for the last 4 fiscal years, and one of your other colleagues thought that maybe we should increase it. I'm just wondering what the Bureau's position is on the provision.
Sir, again, for the benefit of some of the freshman senators, I think if we broke this down, we'd like to be able to discuss the fact that when you have the general fund revenues established at $800 million, and then you net out the provision for refunds, that's that much less money to appropriate for government operations. So that, first and foremost, if you increased it, then you'd have say to 140, you'd have $15 million less to be able to appropriate. The understanding that I have is, first and foremost, we have a 6-month federal mandate to pay income tax refunds. And what we've been able to do is, through aggressive tax collections, take funds that were received and due to the government in prior years and apply those directly to tax refunds. And that's how the government has been able to exceed the provision in the budget without harming government operations, without taking funds away from critical public safety, public health, and education initiatives, and still be within the 6-month filing deadline, or payment deadline, excuse me. So again, I would submit that this is not just a Bureau issue, but more of a revenue tax, Legislature, DOA, maybe even some private sector folks discussing whether or not we want to appropriate more money and therefore have less for operations, or if we keep the status quo number and continue the practice of taking the benefits of really good, sound work by the Department of Revenue Taxation in collecting past due income tax refunds and then applying that accordingly to tax refunds.
Would it make things easier for BBMR if we increase the provision?
Easier
for you, for your cash management. I mean, not cash management, but when you're issuing releases. I know that DOA is responsible for the cash management, but when you're going to release cash or authorize it, Would it make it easier if the provision was increased to 140 or 145? Or then that way you wouldn't be...
Yeah, excuse me, sir. After conferring, and pardon me, but this is William Titanfung. He's one of our budget supervisors. This is Arthur Mariano, another budget supervisor at the Bureau. Both of them with 20-odd years of experience, far more than I will ever obtain at the Bureau. But to answer the question, I think that would not be helpful to us because you would have less money to appropriate. Therefore, our appropriation reserve of 15% would be that much less. And so the meaningfulness of being able to have that 15% allotment reserve would be diminished, you know, just as you take the scale and move them up like that. Less money, less $100, you've got $15 for your appropriation reserve. $50, it's, you know, geez, what's that, 35? I mean, you know, it's commensurately lower. So I don't think that would, you know, immediately benefit us. It would hamper a lot of what it is we'd have to do simply by imposing 15% allotment reserve on less money. It probably.
So you're saying if we would, if more was appropriated and you could say, well, there's appropriations for it, I'll issue the authorization for it or the release. Let Christine figure out where the cash is going to come from.
No, I don't think that's what we would do, sir. I think we are very judicious in being able to understand that agencies are knocking at our doors and asking for either budget modifications first and foremost on the existing allotments. Then afterwards, we would then go into looking at the release of reserves. We would take what it is that we allocate to them based upon the passage of a budget and their monthly allocations with the 15% set aside and work with them to try to ensure that what it is that was authorized, indeed, you know, we can make it work.
Okay. On the business privilege tax, I want to commend your very conservative revenue increase projection. See, it's 100, and I mean, it's only a 4.78, and in the past we've seen twice that as being recommended.
Yes, in the consultation about this time last year with Ricky Hernandez from OFB, we were at a Bank of Guam function and we were all speaking. And so he kind of looked at me and goes, you know, the good news is that BPT continues to rise. And then he smiles, he goes, we just differ on how much it continues to grow. And with that as a backdrop, you know, I know that continued work with, you know, people that assist the legislature in budget formulation, you know, we really don't see things differently, you know, to a great degree. We do have a lot of common ground, and we actually would really welcome a chance to be able to have a little bit more open dialogue. They're very, very good people that assist you guys here at the Office of Finance and Budget.
On Section 30, would you like to explain to the committee what your most recent correspondence is with the Congresswoman's office and what you'd like us to help? You made mention of the fact that we should be working together on something, and I'm just wondering, we all know where we ended up last week. Where are we today as you see it?
Yeah, thank you, sir. Does everybody have a copy of this letter dated? Sorry, wrong letter. May 15th? Would you? There was, as everybody here remembers, a lot of back and forth on Section 30 and the war claims issue. The governor wrote to the Congresswoman, and you'll be getting a copy of her response. The first response that the governor has received in a couple of weeks while we've been discussing this matter. And I'm heartened by the tone of her response. She does say in the letter that her intent was to have as a placeholder the use of Section 30 over and above a certain revenue level to be able to push the legislation forward. She also says in her letter that she continues to work with members of Congress and the Trump administration on alternative funding to address the war claims. I believe she ends by saying that if all else fails and there are no alternatives that are agreed to, sought, or found, that at least there is a mechanism to take care of the war claims issue. And her statement is eerily reminiscent of some of the discussions we had 2 weeks ago, because basically the people want to get closure and they want to get paid. And that was really the bottom line of the special session, was to address tax refunds in a manner to satisfy the people's pleas to get paid, and to, maybe for this fiscal year, this tax filing year, resolve the issue sooner rather than later. So she does open the door for what I hope will be a mutual approach to D.C. by the legislature and the governor's office to find that alternate source, so that the Treasury of Guam is not adversely harmed for something that we would like to bring closure to, but we're not responsible for any of the 3 categories of harm that are outlined in the bill, in federal law. It wasn't us who did it. So I mentioned last week, and I mention again today, I would like to solicit on a personal level the assistance of the members of the 34th Guam Legislature not to accept a $68 million revenue projection, but to fight for something that has those that are still with us collectively, not just the war survivors and their immediate descendants, but we do have 60,000 people here that we have to provide public health, safety, and education needs for. And I would hope that there's a will amongst this body to join together in finding that alternative funding source that does 2 things. That holds us harmless, provides money for continual local needs, but not at the expense of it coming from Section 30, which is our money.
I can assure you that when the placeholder was first announced 3 years ago, that we were very vocal, and we had resolutions asking that it not be utilized. I will defer to your political sensibility on understanding this president and his loyalties, and wonder how much a resolution from a democratically controlled legislature will have in trying to sway him to find an alternate source. But if you think it would help, I think we could work on it. I just would like for your political advisors up there to think about this and see whether or not a resolution from a democratically controlled legislature would have any sway with the administration in trying to address this issue.
And sir, again, with all due respect, a mutually agreed upon resolution, I think, is what I'm seeking in many, many regards. The input from the Democrat majority 34th Guam legislature may not politically have the same weight, but I think the collaborative and unified voice of this body does. And that's, I think, more of what it is I would love to see. I just can't, in my heart, I can't see just laying down to this.
No, I agree. I'm just saying that he's very loyal to those that were with him the first day he announced, and not exactly crazy about the latecomers. So I don't want to impose myself where it would probably best not to. Mm-hmm. But if you really think that it would help, we would consider it, and maybe some of my Republican colleagues will introduce it and put big R's after their name as the main sponsor. But while we're talking about Section 30, you know, was it 2 weeks ago? There was a $9 million deposit in, or at least it showed up in the last CRER, that besides the 1/12 of the amount that was supposed to be attributed every month to Section 30, there was a $9 million increase in Section 30. Do you have any idea what that was all about? Was I the only one that noticed it?
No, sir. From what we know is that was part of reconciliation that was in the works for a while, and it was received and by the Department of Administration and booked. You're right.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we were going to get notification besides the notation on the CRER it had come in, and what reconciliation that was for. Because under this Budget Act, we had passed a special provision that any additional Section 30 money was supposed to have been held separate, and that we would appropriate it. The way this thing was handled, it was under accrual accounting, referred to in March CRER. It was received sometime in, at least from the entry that I could see in the AS 400, sometime in either late April or early May, and it just immediately got sucked up into the payment of tax refunds. We never had a chance to try to segregate it out. When we found out that there was a $9 million. We didn't know it was an Section 30, and so we never had a chance to grab a hold of it and try to appropriate from it. So are we going to get any kind of notification as to what it was about and for, and some paperwork on it, just to at least advise us?
Yeah, I will talk to DOA, and I'll get a response back to you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Vice Chairman, do you have any questions? Anybody? Michael? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've been listening very carefully, and I'm just trying to reconcile what I'm hearing and what sounds like a little inconsistency in terms of how we're approaching the revenue. In the beginning, we talked about the potential for a change in U.S. tax policy that may impact our revenue. And the perspective was we shouldn't necessarily take that into consideration because it really hasn't happened yet. And so at this juncture, we're just going to continue to operate as if that's not something to factor in at this time.
Thank you very much for that question, Senator Nicholas. There has been a lot of work done by the Bureau to reach out to people that are in the quote-unquote, business on the mainland. I personally spoke to people from Vanguard this morning, and I've been asking questions from Citi and Barclays and getting perspective from their economists on what it is that we should be looking at with respect to changes, with respect to President Trump and his initiatives. When I was in D.C. in February, we met with staffers from both the House and the Senate side, and they were first and foremost still getting, settled in. It was kind of funny because they were looking at each other, saying, "You got notepads?" We don't even have notepads yet, but the primary focus in Washington, D.C. at that time was repeal of Obamacare. And nobody wanted to do a lot of, talking about anything past Obamacare, because the order of priority was Obamacare, then the tax reform. So what I have been able to discern through, phone calls, emails, and everything in preparation for today's hearing was that the same thing holds true about President Trump. What we do know is that we don't know what is going to happen. And I think that the statements by Frank Pompeo recently, and echoed by lots of people in Washington, D.C., that, yeah, there was a American Health Care Act passed by the House, but there's going to be a big, debate in the Senate. And that, guys, senators, we seem to always have that, Congress here, but when it gets to the Senate, all of a sudden things just, go badly. So there is a consensus amongst people that I spoke to that the waters got even more muddied by the firing of the FBI director, and that the Senate isn't going to be as open to discuss some of the president's initiatives simply because they want to distance themselves from him. So I don't know if, first and foremost, the repeal of Obamacare really has legs. I would submit that the tax reform measures are also way down the road, and that I don't believe that, given the fact that there's so much uncertainty as to what the campaign promises were and what may end up somehow down the road be approved, I think that there's such a big disparity that that we should stay the course. The Vanguard report that I got, I spoke to one of their economists this morning, and the report is dated December of 2016, but the takeaway is that they're going to continue what they call a base case approach for calendar year 17. That there's too many unknowns. That phrase came up several times in our discussion today. Too many unknowns to be able to understand, either from the sell side or the buy side of Vanguard. And I think Senator Nicholas is well aware of Vanguard's reputation in the financial advisory role, not just as an entity that holds a significant interest on Guam bonds, but they also do business in the region, either for the marshals or for the Republic of Palau in financial advisory services. So the takeaway is that it may not be the best thing to do to again state that these numbers are set in stone, but rather to engage in dialogue with members of the legislature on where we collectively think we may be going, with 4 months left in the fiscal year.
Well, the reason I'm asking that is because that statement has a different framework from your subsequent statement about the Section 30 money and what the existing laws numbers reflect versus what we're hoping would be the better case scenario. In other words, we don't want to assume the worst case scenario when it comes to the Trump tax policies, but we don't want to assume the worst case scenario when it comes to those policies, but we want to assume the best case scenario when it comes to the Section 30 realities. And right now, our Congresswoman made it clear in her letter that she says, I also underscored, should the worst case scenario occur and we are not able to obtain alternative funding from the President, the bill will provide a real funding source to ensure that our Manamku will receive their claim and finally be recognized for their suffering during World War II. So I'm worried that we're being optimistic on both extremes. We're being optimistic that the Trump tax policies will not come to fruition because the existing tax laws don't reflect it and there isn't any motion to change it. But the existing law about Section 30 is in force, and there also isn't any motion to change that. So shouldn't we then, if we're going to be consistent with not changing our projections based on what hasn't happened yet on the Trump side, shouldn't we also base our Section 30 projections on what has already happened and not on what hasn't happened? And since it's already existing law that it's 68 million, shouldn't we be basing our Section 30 projection on that figure if we're going to be consistent with our optimism?
I think, Senator, that we're saying the same things, but in a different manner. I would, again, submit that we should, as the speaker pointed out, collaborate in trying to get resolution to an alternate funding source for Section 30. I think we agree on that, and I think she makes it clear that she's not stopping her efforts to be able to find that. So with respect to the optimism, my optimism is buoyed by the fact that she just wrote this letter, because if she closed the door, then I think you may have a point that reality has set in. But she hasn't closed the door. Far from it. She's basically said the door's open and we have this opportunity. However, this does provide closure. So I think we're saying the same thing, just in a little bit different manner. I think we should, and I encourage participation, really sincerely I do, to try to get a unified voice to find that alternate funding source. And I also think that since there isn't a tax plan to base a reduced revenue source on, that it's kind of like, okay, what are we doing? So in both cases, as opposed to taking and settling for a worst case, I would encourage the body, take up an effort to try to achieve a better case for both.
Yeah, I think we're not saying the same thing. What I'm saying is, if we're going to base it on actuals, we should always base it on actuals. So if we're going to base our projections on income taxes based on the actuals rather than what Trump proposes, then we should also base our Section 30 on the actuals and not what we hope Madeline can accomplish by getting some kind of concession. So if we're going to budget actual to actual, then we really should use a lower Section 30 figure. And if we're going to do that, how do we go about then reconciling a $68 million figure versus a $78 million figure? Because, you know, when it comes to a budget is different from, you know, hope and optimism. You know, I would love for us to get 78 million, 88 million, 98 million, but if right now it shows that the number is 68 million, we should budget for that, and if it comes in higher, then we can begin looking at adjustments. But if it's going to be based on actuals, it should be based on actuals across the board. Don't you think?
I don't. No, I don't. And the reason why I say that is because I don't believe that the issue is dead and that we should just concede to the 68 just because it's written in a law that we actually thought up until the days leading into special session and during special session that the threshold was $120 million. And so we would like to revisit all of these things with the help of the legislature. I don't believe that that is the approach to take. And I also would like to point out that budget projections are that. They're projections. They can be optimistic. They can be conservative. They can actually be, you know, a reversal of a trend. But what we're all doing with this exercise here today is being able to come to an understanding of what as a body and what as a policy for the operations of fiscal 18, our projections based upon, you know, 3- and 5-year historical lookbacks may or may not be. And there have been times early on in the Cowboy administration where I would submit that budget projections from the administration were on point. There has been a deviation from that over the last couple of years. You know, history is pretty clear on that. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that we have not had our fair share of successes with budget projections in the first 4 years.
Okay, so if we're going to hold firm to that $10 million difference on the Section 30, and if BBMR is going to be certain that that $10 million is going to come in to the point where we're not going to factor it into this budget, then would it be too far-fetched then to say that we're going to tag the administration's budget to that $10 million figure?
I don't think that's fair, sir, because that wouldn't be our position. If you're saying right now you are going to stay with the 68, that's your number.
If the money's coming in, then there shouldn't be a concern. If the money's not coming in, then all of a sudden there would be. So if we're going to be firm about $10 million actually coming in, then we shouldn't really concern ourselves where we tag that money to. So that's why I ask, is this money really going to be there? Because if not, then we're talking about washing $10 million into the overall budget and then somebody getting cut. If we're not going to go with the actuals, and if we're going to hang our hat on this optimism, then would the administration be okay hanging its own hat on that optimism?
No. I don't think that this is over with. I don't think that this body should think that 68 is what you want to be appropriating to date. Maybe in August, when we've exhausted all efforts, then maybe there'll be a mutual consensus that we tried and we didn't get it, and what the body passes by the end of August is reflective of a very concerted fight to be able to try to get redress. But today, no way.
We get our Section 3 money in the end of September. So if we were to instead be conservative and use 68 million versus 78 million, pass the budget at the end of August, and then come end of September, 1 month later, we all of a sudden see that it was in fact 78 million, and we have 10 million more, wouldn't it be more prudent for us to, at that point, appropriate an additional $10 million that we know came in, versus hoping that we have 78 in the end of August, and the end of September comes and we only have 68, and no one's going to want to rush out to tell everybody where to cut $10 million more. So wouldn't it be just as prudent to just say, let's go with a $68 million figure, the actuals that we at least are able to acknowledge right now, and come 1 month later, end of September, if the 78 comes in, we can all jump all over ourselves to figure out where $10 million more is going to go. And would BBMR be willing to help us with that?
In late July, early August, when we're in the finalization of the budget after having exhausted all good faith efforts, and we come to a realization that a budget has to be passed by the end of August, and the writing is on the wall that it's 68, then at that point in time, I would agree that 68 might be prudent. But today, I will submit no way. We're going to fight that number. And when we come to an agreement later this summer, we may be at that point. But right now, I would, again, it's almost like people are just, okay, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. I just think it's wrong not to fight it.
No, I very much agree with you, but my thing is that, you know, when we're talking about budgeting, we've got to just deal with the actuals that we're looking at. And as the agencies come in with their own hearings over the course of this budget process, for us to just continuously move forward in an area that we're just not sure about, I would be much more comfortable going with 68, getting guidance from BBMAR on where that other 10 million should come from, and then having those very real conversations with the agencies over the next couple of weeks, and then being pleasantly surprised come the end of September, versus us holding firm on a number for principal purposes, but from a budget perspective, running the risk of coming up short just 1 month after actually passing the budget. And then having gone through that entire exercise of all the agencies having come before us, we'd be in a much better place to have that conversation now than to have that conversation at the end of September. So would BBMR be willing to give us a budget with a $10 million difference reflecting the Section 30 actuals right now?
As I mentioned earlier, if we could convene the SAS, SES, get a better consensus of what people inside and outside of this group that's gathered here today think would be, you know, policy direction. And if those meetings are held in later this month or in June, and you know, despite our best efforts, the writing then becomes very apparent on the wall, then we would have to all engage in policy formulation accordingly. But today, no, we're not going to have submitted a revised budget. No.
Well, I'll yield to the Chair on Appropriations then to determine whether or not he wants to move forward with a $78 million figure or a $68 million figure. But absent guidance from the Bureau, that would mean that the Legislature would then need to determine how we're going to go about making that interpretation. And my preference would be, if the Bureau isn't going to provide the guidance, tag the Bureau and tag the administration, because BBMR's budget plus the administration's budget is $10 million. And so if we're going to hang everything on that 10 million, then by all means, you know. But I'm just very uncomfortable putting education, health, and public safety into the crosshairs of a $10 million difference that isn't reflected in the actuals that we're facing today.
I would point out, sir, if you're going to use that type of analogy, that the budget that's being proffered for the operations of the legislature is $8 million. So, you know, I mean, it's kind of balanced in that respect. So if you want to say this is where you're going to cut, well, include the legislature, because we're talking about the same, you know, economies of scale.
We are, but it's the administration and BBMR that's being insistent on the 10 million.
We're not being insistent. We're not being insistent. We're just trying to garner support, not to be able to just acquiesce to this. It's as simple as that.
And no one's saying we're going to acquiesce, but when it comes to budgeting, I prefer to budget on actuals.
Yeah, and I believe, as the speaker mentioned, this is the first of many dialogues that we're going to have on this subject, and I don't think it's prudent to be able to say today we're going to accept this, even for, I mean, you guys haven't adopted a revenue number. So, you know, we've proffered one.
All right.
So where are we, you know, with respect to either mutually agreeing to a revenue number or agreeing to disagree? That's down the road.
Right.
And I don't think that we just need to have BBMR's line, you know, signature right now that we are going to do something that we are hell-bent in not doing right now.
I'm just having the conversation because we are talking about Section 30.
I appreciate that, sir. I do. Thank you.
It was brought up earlier also by the chairman about the provision for tax refunds, and that's just very pronounced in my mind, and it's very pronounced in our community right now, particularly because when we were having the discussions during the special session not too long ago, we were provided with charts that showed the actual tax refunds that were paid out versus the provision. And then we were also provided with a letter from the governor during a previous budget session where the governor was insisting on a lower provision amount, only to come to find out later on in that special session we had not too long ago that that lower provision amount was now being used as the rationale for why refunds were not getting funded the way they probably should be. And you mentioned today that the reason why they were able to fund the refunds over those prior fiscal years was because of aggressive tax collections that brought in the extra money. And so I just wanted to, I guess, since we're under oath and get it on the record, in 2016, we provisioned $125 million, and we brought in and we paid out $149 million in taxes. $149 million paid out, $125 was the provision, so that's $24 million difference. So we actually collected $24 million more in FY 2016 than we had originally projected, and that was how we were able to make up that shortfall?
That's my understanding, sir, that we have been able to, number one, be guided by the federal court order. So whether we like it or not, we'll find the money, but that the provision has been exceeded, as the speaker mentioned, on the last 5 or 6 years. So there were discussions that have been present where the monies that have been utilized to pay that difference has come from aggressive tax collections. And I know that the past due collection number was extremely high. It was in excess of $100 million and has gone down dramatically because of some valiant efforts to be able to collect on due obligations to the government. So I don't have a problem under oath stating that that's what I believe is how we're doing what we're doing to comply with the court order.
I do not recall at any point, and the administration is very good at announcing when there's a lot of financial successes. I don't recall at any point being informed that we somehow in FY 2016 collected $24 million more than what we were originally projecting. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because if we are collecting way more, I don't understand how those are not reconciling into the deficit equations that are getting reported by the public auditor. And I'm trying to figure out how we collect $24 million more in a fiscal year, like 2015, for example. That's another $23 million more, based on the $125 million provision. And then on 2014, that's another $9 million more. So we're getting told by our auditor that we're reflecting these deficits, but then we're getting testimonies saying that our collections are aggressive and they're more than what we actually projected. So I'm just having a very difficult time putting those two figures together, and I agree with the chairman. Perhaps it would just be easier for us to increase the provision so that those collections are being adequately reflected in the overall budget. Because from my understanding, when we budget, it's already taking into consideration our collection history.
That's correct. The 125 is netted off the top of any general fund revenues that this body would authorize. So yes, you're correct. And I think again, if we had the presence of Mr. Camacho and Mrs. Benito to be able to discuss the merits of increasing the provision for tax refunds, I think we'd have a better idea collectively on where we would go with that. The question that was posed to BBMR was, would that assist you in your allotment control? And my response was no, it wouldn't. But that doesn't mean that there needs to be an upward adjustment based upon the trends, and I don't disagree with that. But I would ask that any decision be left to a discussion that we would have with the people from Rev and Tax at least present.
I agree with you. And as a matter of fact, there is one piece of good news in all that. I introduced a bill that we have yet to work through our legislative process that would actually mandate that the Department of Revenue and Tax provide the collection reports every single month. So individual corporate withholding will be able to see what the collections are or are not. And that way we wouldn't be wondering whether or not there really was 24 million in additional collections in FY 2016, because we would be able to get the reports to inform us of that. So I'd just like to ask for the support of my colleagues to be able to move that measure forward, because obviously getting these collection reports is critical to us determining what our provision for tax refunds would probably need to be in the fiscal year budget determination. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know DOA and DRT is obviously not here, but I'm just wondering if BBMR on a daily basis or weekly basis gets to see on a ledger or the day-to-day real-time transactions being made. Do you have access to that type of information? Because I'm just trying to, the previous speaker spoke about collections, so, and a report, but I'm sure that
I'm being advised that we don't see a daily report, and that we are given information that we utilize to provide the CRER on a monthly basis.
But okay, so, but with those numbers, I'm sure, I'm being on the fiscal team. Are you able to, with those day-to-day transactions or real-time transactions, able to reconcile? I'm looking at these numbers. I'm just wondering how they derive with reconciling with what's being filed, the taxes being collected up there. So if you're looking at the day-to-day transactions, are they being reconciled weekly, monthly? I'm not sure if you guys could answer that, but I'm just wondering how we generate these reports. We're trying to mandate, or there's a proposal to mandate these reports, but I'm just trying to understand, because I'm trusting, just based on history, that BBMR is able to generate these numbers from to a methodology, but I'm just trying to figure out if these numbers are being reconciled weekly, or with whatever real-time transactions that are coming in, so we know that they're accurate.
We, again, for purposes of preparing the CRER, get information provided by the Department of Administration on what the collections were, and then the report is generated. What I believe maybe Senator St. Nicholas is requesting, we don't see that on a day-to-day basis. We don't see, particularly with respect to what our continuing liability is, because that changes based upon people's filing. It changes based upon the refunds that are paid out. And I think Mr. Camacho and Mrs. Boleto basically have a better idea of what that is versus what it is I believe that we get. Because as the speaker mentioned, they're the cash, they're the receiving entity. The Department of Revenue Taxation is very proud of the fact that they generate 98% of government revenue, and the Department of Administration is the recipient of a lot of hard work at the Department of Revenue Taxation, being able to manage the cash that comes in and then pay out, refunds, payroll, all those other things. So no, we don't get it day to day. It would be information overload for us, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm just trying to understand. I know certainly you have mandates before you to follow in the revenue tax and DOA, but I'm just trying to understand how these numbers go up and down, up 10%, and some by 19 million less, or increases, and I'm just wondering if those are like real-time generations, or looking at it that you'll be able to meet those numbers. But I do look forward to the Special Economic Committee report, committee, so that way all parties are there to at least understand how information moves, or if this is open data that you'll get to see and can make this all clear to us. Because I'm certainly I'm just trying to understand. I know you guys are the expert. I'm just trying to understand how when a transaction is made at revenue tax, how quickly that is looked at and reconciled, whatever was collected by DOA or BBMR.
And again, sir, we don't collect anything, nor do we disperse anything. So I think this is a great opportunity, particularly with the influx of freshman senators, and we welcome the opportunity to have that dialogue.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Carlson, just looking at the projections from BBMR, general fund projections, general fund proposed revenue has increased. Special fund revenue and federal matching grants in aid has decreased from fiscal year 16 to 17. So can you confirm again for us your basis for these projections and the reasoning, and explain the differences between each fund revenue source and the proposed drop-in projection for the federal matching grants in aid, as well as the special fund revenue? So I'm looking at an increase in general fund, about $41 million, and then a decrease in special fund revenue, $7 million, and a decrease in federal matching grants and aid, about $3.6 million.
May I ask what page you're referring to, ma'am? Or is that your own analysis, or is it in the budget?
So this is just a summary chart for the graph that you provided for us.
What page, may I ask? So we can make sure we're looking at what you're looking at.
Let me check in. So my staff put together, based on what you had submitted to us in January, we summarized all of these. So the general fund available for appropriation from fiscal year 17, which was authorized, was $681 million. Fiscal year 18 proposed is $722 million. So the difference is an increase in $41 million. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
For special fund revenue, FY17 authorized is $209 million, and FY18 proposed is $201 million. So that's a difference of 7.2, a decrease in 7.2. Federal matching grants and aid is $47.9 million. Fiscal year 18 proposed is $44.3 million. So the difference is about $3.6 million. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around the basis for these projections, the reasoning for these projections, and if you can explain the differences between each fund revenue source and the proposed drop in projection for both the special fund revenue and the federal matching grants and aid.
We can provide you with an overall response to the comment, but not to be disrespectful, or again, for lack of term, but you're asking us to discuss special fund revenues and other things outside of what it is that we're prepared to talk to you about today, because today was supposed to be specific to general fund, and the general fund categories and special fund revenues are two different animals. So you're correct in your first statement. That
I'm just asking if you can confirm your basis for these projections?
It's the same methodology. Normally, it's based upon a 3-year projection review. So there is some methodology that is basically employed throughout. The even for things like outside of this discussion, the tourist attraction fund and other funds that are not covered in today's discussion. But yes, the whole basis is. Even back to what Senator San Nicolas talked about, historical. So that is the basis. And then with respect to some of the special funds, those are, again, incumbent upon what the fees that were collected for these special funds resulted in. So, hypothetically speaking, right, if the dog catcher fee, dropped because we're not catching that many dogs, and of course, we would reflect that because we took a look at the 3-year average. So there is a methodology that is employed, and for it is kind of a wide-ranging question that you're asking. So if we broke it down, some of them are fee-related, and it's based upon the collection of those fees, and some of them are fund-related, and we can have a little bit better, but both are inherently based on historical.
I guess I just wanted to reiterate the concern of the speaker in what's being reported in Department of Labor reports as 0 for federal contracts for calendar year 2017 that he referred to earlier. And, I'll continue to advocate for relief for H-2B visa denials, but I'm really concerned about the expectation specifically for the Manpower Development Fund, as it's so reliant on the processing of H-2B workers locally. And they're really looking forward to working together with you and with my colleagues to get under those numbers and just make sure that we have a solid plan going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Moody, because we really would like to engage in that exercise ourselves. I think it's going to be mutually beneficial. I've been with BBMR for 2.5 years. There's a lot I need to learn myself. So I thoroughly would embrace, more meetings to be able to get better color, better understanding of what it is, going down the line, so that we're all on the same page and we can make, decisions accordingly. So I look forward to that as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Anybody? If not, thank you, Mr. Carlson and your team. And we will have to read this carefully. This budget hearing is now recessed until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning when we will meet with the Guam Memorial Hospital Authority. Okay?
Thank you very much.